Good afternoon. Happy summer and welcome to our subscribers for the 7th edition of the GovCon HR Round-Up podcast. My name is Joe Young. I am the president of GovConPay. We are the only outsourced payroll and HR firm dedicated exclusively to serving the needs of the government contracting marketplace. As always, we are coming to you live from the amazing studios here at BLC Digital Strategies, the media affiliate of Berenzweig Leonard LLP, and under the leadership and direction of our producer, Mr. Todd Castleberry. I am here with the founding partners and employment law experts, Seth Berenzweig and Declan Leonard from Berenzweig and Leonard. Good to see you guys. You guys want to do a quick intro before we get going?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Seth Berenzweig, and I help lead our corporate transactional and GovCon practice here at the firm, and great to be here today.
And I'm Declan Leonard. I head up our firm's employment law practice. I always enjoy getting in the studio, Joe, with you and doing these. It's hard to believe. So we're more than halfway done. This signals the second half of the year. So we're on number 7. You got 5 more to go. These things are always good. I always love the topics we come up with, and I hope everyone finds this useful in their practices.
No, absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be with you gentlemen as well. Before we jump in today's topic, do have some exciting news to share with our audience here. We are excited to announce that the Roundup has its first sponsor. We are really glad to have as a promotional sponsor our friends and partners from Berkshire Associates. For introducing the Roundup to their client base and supporting these messagings and these efforts that we're trying to do monthly and bring to the industry. For those of you who are not familiar, Berkshire is a HR compliance experts with over 50 years of experience. They focus a lot on affirmative action, pay equity, DEI services. They are the subject matter experts of subject matter experts in these areas. And we really appreciate their support. And I welcome anybody out there who maybe is not familiar with them to please visit their website at berkshireassociates.com to learn more about the great work they're doing and for people in our community as well.
Yeah, and I can attest firsthand, working with some of our clients that, run into these. They make it on the list of being audited for their affirmative action plans, working with Lynn Clements and her team. And in fact, Lynn will probably fill the seat at least once. At one of these roundups. She's a fantastic speaker, and Berkshire does great work in this area, and it's definitely a very niche area, and they're the ones to call, definitely.
Yeah, an important topic and something we're actually even touch on a little bit today.
Yeah.
Great opportunity to come back and dive into it deeper in a fuller program. So for today's topic, we're going to talk about HR audits, something that obviously everybody's familiar with, everybody knows they should be doing, they're probably doing, but we'll probably jump into it maybe in a little bit more detail about what are maybe some best practices, things you should be thinking about as you look at that as a part of the work that your HR organization does. So just to kick it off, Seth, what do we mean by HR audit, and what are some of the things that people should be thinking about?
So let's talk about what an HR audit is not. An HR audit is not an angry employee marching into your office with a torch and a pitchfork going in and trying to take prisoners. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an internal, analytical, collaborative process where the team provides a reflection and a review and analysis of your current strengths, weaknesses, and a gap analysis to try to accumulate information to make a determination of how you can better improve your human resource practices and how to be able to improve your process and your documents. It's an opportunity to proactively fix problems. It's always easier and less expensive to fix a problem before it arises. It's like the old saying that it's always easiest and timely to fix your roof while the sun is shining as opposed to when it's storming. So
good way to put it. Yeah.
So it's definitely the old adage of an ounce of prevention, and it's something that is popular, but it's also a very important topic that we're going to be lifting up the hood and talking about a bit more today.
And we were talking about this before we came in the studio here. The word audit, it does have, sometimes, you think of an IRS audit, it definitely definitely has that
Right.
negative connotation.
Creates fear right out of the
exactly.
start,
And
yeah.
I think that definitely what we want to really stress here today is that, as Seth just said, it's really a collaborative process, and really companies should approach it. And we're going to be talking about it specifically for government contractors because that is our audience base here, and that is what we believe to be particularly important to be doing these HR audits as in the GovCon space. But they should really look at it as an opportunity, and really an opportunity to see where they are competitively and to proactively improve. So don't be thrown off by this word audit.
I would also add, too, I think one thing that you said, Seth, is really important is the word about process. I think we all know there's like we're reviewing documents, we're reviewing manuals, reviewing policies. We joke a lot in our business, we're in the technology, bringing technology tools to HR departments. And I tell people a lot that we're kind of more in the HR process re-engineering business with technology. And a lot of this is about, well, how do we do things and what are our processes to make sure we're more compliant at the end of the day, not just the pieces along the way. So I think that's an important part to look at as well.
No, you're right. And as we'll talk about, like, you can have all the processes in the world and you can have all the great policies in the world. But I think what the HR audit is designed to do is to make sure, A, that you have those in place, but B, that you're actually following them and implementing them in practice. And we'll talk about some of the pitfalls that we have seen in this process as we move forward this discussion.
And this is the GovCon HR Round-Up.
There you go.
Of course, why is some of this particularly important to our GovCon audience?
Yeah, and I'm sure the audience is knows exactly probably why. I mean, government contractors, more so than just regular commercial companies, are subject to just so many more regulations, FAR regulations, as well as so many other regulations and oversight and potential for investigations. It's a cost of doing business with the federal government. Most of you out there realize it's a great industry that you're in. We saw during COVID that the federal government was able to keep things going, and that's why we see a lot of private equity who usually shun the GovCon market is now like jumping into it because they see great opportunities there. But with opportunity comes compliance, regulations. And so, you've got things like we talked about before that Berkshire handles, OFCCP compliance, 50 or more employees, all of a sudden you've got to have a written affirmative action plan. You've got to be keeping track of your EEO one forms, so there's all these different things that you've got to, for government contractors, there's so much more compliance. You've got, if you're doing Service Contract Act contracts, you've got wage and fringe issues that you always have to strictly abide by, Davis-Bacon compliance. Sometimes what you'll see, particularly for Service Contract Act, is unions. There'll be unions in the workplaces, and therefore you'll have CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, and that really just sets for the whole separate list of do's and don'ts that employers have to abide by. And then finally, and we'll talk a little bit deeper about this because I think this is a big area for HR audits for government contractors, DCAA compliance and DCAA audits. The Defense Contract Audit Agency, it's not strictly HR. It also comes into play really on the accounting and the finance side of things, but that's a big part of compliance. I think, Joe, you have seen that in the work that you all do for this.
No, absolutely. I know we're going to touch a little bit on maybe some of the things with time and maybe jump in there, but that's definitely an area where that leads into the HR part, but just out of finance and some of the other requirements they have on the finance side.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'd just sort of wrap up this little topic by saying this part of it is, these things, if you want to hit them proactively, because if you're in a protest and somebody starts to raise some of these irregularities, that could very well spell doom for a contract that you otherwise should have won. So we're not saying let's do this because it's a pie in the sky, like this is great, let's do it. It actually helps you win business and keep business.
And it helps you avoid preventable problems. As long as you root it out proactively and you take care of it, then it's not going to come up later as a problem because you have it under control.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And Declan, what are some best practices as far as the process of conducting these audits, of frequency and when, and the things that should go into that?
Yeah, and there's certainly no one size fits all. I mean, it's going to depend a lot on, what the company is like, what industry you're in. We talked a little bit before about some of those things like Service Contract Act and whether or not there's a union involved. So, like, some of these things will dictate how you actually conduct an HR audit. But really, we'll talk a little bit later about whether or not you do this internally or whether or not you use an outside consultant or some combination or even legal counsel if you want to protect privilege. But you really start at a bare bones, a questionnaire, a checklist. Anybody who has ever done any kind of an M&A deal knows that they have these due diligence checklists, and it's not dissimilar to that. It's basically saying, where are we with all this stuff? Let's face it, when you're in operations, you're sometimes drinking from the fire hydrant, you're going a mile a minute. You don't sometimes sit back and say, what is our recruiting process? What is our retention process? And so I think you start with a questionnaire to the key stakeholders. A lot of HR departments have, employee relations separate from the recruiting function. And I think you start to reach out to them and you start to collect data and then you take it from there. But like the areas that you really want to be covering, I talked about retention and recruitment. Compensation trips up companies, government contractors all the time. Employee benefits, performance management, legal compliance, training programs, things of that nature. So it's not just, you really want to go the full gamut of HR when you're doing one of these HR audits.
Yeah, and my colleague Kyle shared, we were talking, we use, audit, and you talk about due diligence.
Yeah.
But approach these as you said, a dialogue, not an interrogation. Where can we, obviously compliance is at the root of all this, but a lot of things you're mentioning are best practices that are making your company more attractive to work at, more attractive to stay, and retention. So these things go into a lot of the greater goals of the HR departments beyond checking compliance boxes.
Very much.
And I think it's interesting, and Declan, I think you probably touched upon this a little bit, but the notion of HR training programs is something that I always find to be an interesting aspect, because how, if at all, is the HR department looking at and considering training? We, not that we're playing this, I don't even want to indicate that we're trying to roll this into any kind of a commercial, but when's the last time that you provided any training to your managers with regard to some of the major HR updates with regard to the developments in human resource and employment law? Yeah. Because when you talk about the process and the steps that you can do to have a cost down, revenues up approach, training or the lack of training is something that should be factored in as well. So that's another factor to keep into the back of your mind.
And just before we move on, the issue of communication, we talked at the very beginning that audit kind of has this negative connotation to it. When you are starting one of these HR audits, when you are sending out, let's say, questionnaires and you're assembling data and you're trying to figure out, okay, where are we now versus where do we want to go as a result of this HR audit, communication is going to be the key. You really need to communicate to the workforce and to the people who are handling recruiting, the people who are handling retention, the people who are handling compensation, all that this is not like a gotcha or a problem or anything like that. They should look at this very much as a collaborative opportunity to ascertain. You may find that, 5 out of your 8 functions in HR are really killing it. They are matching very much with best practices in the industry, and 3 have a few gaps. But that's the whole point, is not to find necessarily problems, but rather to make you more competitive in the industry.
Yeah, and I think as we kind of get into this detail too, I think when people hear HR audit, the first thing is like, well, when was the last time you updated your handbook?
Yeah.
This goes well beyond the handbook. This is a much deeper conversation that, it's been 2 years, it's time to kind of relook at the language in our handbook.
Definitely, yep.
Absolutely.
So as our HR professionals and organizations go through this process and kind of take this dive, what are some of the common findings that we're seeing that continue to maybe come up that people have to be cognizant of and be prepared to kind of focus on?
Well, I think we devoted a whole roundup to this topic. The issue of the fact that government contractors, perhaps more so than regular commercial companies, operate in so many different states.
Yeah.
And sometimes, unbeknownst to them, they have employees working remote and not even realizing, wait, you relocated to California? When did you do that? It's one of those things.
What state they're in.
Yeah, they don't even know.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that's one of the biggest common findings. As we know, pay transparency. Each of these states have just become just their own fiefdoms, and it really makes it tough for government contractors and the particularly HR folks trying to keep track of all this.
it's interesting in our world in the payroll business, and we have, Kyle joined our program last month. We have an HR team that goes out and supports some of our clients in this work. We know where their employees are. We got to pay their taxes.
Yeah, oh, that's true. Yeah.
And a lot of times the HR department, is maybe they're finding that out, and all of a sudden, it's coming up that like, hey, do you know where we need an ID in California or Colorado now? Have we looked again at the handbook? Do we need an addendum? So, yeah, those, we see that a lot in our space because that's a trigger of, when those people relocate.
I think also one of the aspects that comes up from time to time is the issue of misclassification. There are times where there can be a little bit of a blurry line between who is a 1099 contractor and who's a W-2 employee. And sometimes that's easy to draw the lines, and sometimes it can be a little bit blurry. But that's something that needs to be reviewed, because sometimes when someone gets plugged in quickly, there's not always the finest attention to detail on those sorts of things.
True.
And when you talk about how states each have their own little hot messes, let's just talk for a minute about Virginia. For the longest time, Virginia really could not care less about whether or not you were misclassified. And then all of a sudden, recently, Virginia did a U-turn, and now misclassification is really considered a really hot topic, with a lot of significant statutory penalties associated with that. So not only who do you have in your workforce fleet, but how are they classified? Because that's something that, again, you definitely want to be proactive on that, as opposed to trying to fix the problem in reverse.
And you can't look at these HR audits as just like a snapshot in time. You can't say, well, I did one in January, and so therefore these have to be sort of an ongoing process. To your point, Seth, like every state does things differently. Virginia laws usually go into effect on July 1st of each year. And so if you're missing it, if you only do these HR audits once a year, and you do them in January, you're going to go 6 months where you're arguably, violating the law, or you just don't understand like what the law is.
Right.
And that's a significant legal risk sitting out there.
Sure. So from a timing standpoint, you certainly want to do it at least once a year. Although, as Declan, as you've noted, if you do it even less than that, then you have an even larger time gap relative to some other changes that are going on in various states, where government contractors can have their employees knowingly or unwittingly, where Mary might have just picked up and moved to San Francisco and didn't exactly bother to tell anybody. One of the other aspects and a reason for conducting these audits is, and we're talking about the element of being proactive, not only from a cost-benefit analysis, but for companies that believe that they may at some point in the reasonably near future be in the M&A space in terms of mergers and acquisitions. One of the things that doesn't surprise me is when companies have an LOI, a letter of intent, and they say, let's talk. And let's go into a due diligence period. And they say, okay, fine, we're going to load up the data room, and then you guys can go ahead and lift up the hood and sniff around and tell me what's going on. There are many times where, unfortunately, it is at that point where the prospective purchaser looks in and just, is like looking into a cavern where there's a lot of gaps and missing documents. Or there are documents that are in there, but they haven't been updated in 5-6 years to comply with some of the most basic requirements. Now's the time to be able to take a look at that. The whole idea of getting ready for a transaction is to enhance the inherent value of your company. You are much better off valuing your company and presenting it like a diamond in a velvet box, as opposed to being stuffed in a crumpled paper bag. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
So that's great. So not only can doing this and being proactive and consistent help you potentially win win contracts with the federal government, and then hold on to them during a protest because you got your ducks in a row. But it also makes you more attractive as a target for a liquidation. I mean, for an exit. And listen, a lot of our clients, that's the name of the game. They really want to build up the company, hopefully build up, their prime contract backlog, and then sell. And your point is perfect. Why? I mean, do that on a regular basis and don't get caught off guard when all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, we just got approached by somebody who wants to buy us, and we have not even looked at our HR function, because HR is a huge part. We've talked about this in other contexts. HR is a huge part of the due diligence process when you're looking to sell. So don't just start, at the tail end of the process.
And I will say, seeing from experience, and I think some of our HR professionals will be nodding their heads out there, we find that the GovCons are a little slow to invest in HR.
Yeah.
We work with a lot of emerging GovCons, under 50 employees. That's not the first key C-suite leadership role they're looking to fill. We see a lot of solutions where you've got a CFO or a finance and somebody else, like, who's HR? And they're like, well, I handle this piece, this person handles that.
Right.
And they don't have a true professional. And then they grow fast.
Right.
They win a contract.
Yeah.
And they're over 50 employees overnight.
And they've staffed it quickly, so they don't have the documents in there. If they do, then they misclassify, or there's inconsistencies, or they're plugging square pegs into round holes.
And the irony of it is, so many of our clients in the government contracting space are really just people. Like, you know what I mean? Some of them have software, but really the majority of them are service-based companies, which means people, which means you would think HR would just be right up there, just with a seat at everything because of how important it is.
Yeah.
This is one way doing an HR audit will highlight how important their people are.
I know our team discovers a lot of our clients we work with when we go in and do these audits, and they're over 50 employees, and they're like, what's an AAP and why do we need it?
It's always reactive.
More often than it should be happening. But I think it's the nature of the business a little bit too.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of these findings. You alluded to the timekeeping issues under DCAA, and I think that that's a huge part of the focus. And this is where HR cannot do these in a vacuum. HR has to do these audits in conjunction with the accounting, the finance, and the just general operations. They can't just be saying, well, no, we're doing this audit, this is in this division, and timekeeping is a big issue. You've seen that in your work.
We see that every day. So we are in the HR, more the people side of the product, but most of our clients, there are specific products and softwares out there that cater to this market to address the needs of being a DCA compliant time and attendance and expense system. As most people know, a lot of people are like, hey, are you DCA compliant? Defense Contract Audit Agency isn't out there putting a stamp of approval on time systems, but everybody knows there's the four bigs, the Uninets, the cost points, the Procasses, the JAMIS. They're in this business for a reason, because they have unique needs that their clients need.
Yeah.
And we have really built our business around integrating kind of our HR piece with those time systems, because they're very unique requirements and how we can tie those together. So we see that as obviously a very important piece and a compliance piece that people need to understand, that they just can't be taking out of the box time and attendance systems and growing and making sure they're going to meet those compliance requirements from a time and expense perspective.
Yeah, timekeeping is critical. I mean, in non-GovCon aspects, maybe not as much. But when you're talking about government contractors and you're talking about being DCAA compliant, I mean, you've got to have strict policies where people are entering their time. If it's a time and materials contract, that people are entering their time on a daily basis. You need to have the right controls and systems so that they're not flouting the rules under DCAA. They're not able to go in a couple days later and tweak their time, things of that nature. I mean, there's so many different specific things. And listen, HR is dealing with timekeeping. They're dealing with this stuff. So while it also is an accounting and finance function, HR is very travel reimbursements. I mean, most of those are being directed and routed to HR. But the way you handle those and how you allocate those to a particular contract has huge implications if you are audited by DCAA. So this is another example of why it's so important to do this.
So is it okay to submit time and expense reports like FTX, where they would put in emojis and
oh, is that what they were doing?
Yeah, they
Our
literally
friends,
they were putting in emojis and using social media for their. Don't do that.
Yeah.
That could be an audit
That's not
issue.
yeah.
Exactly, a little little bit. Yeah.
Let's see. Just a couple of other things before we move on to our final topic. We talked about the various states and how they have their different rules. Whether it's restrictive covenants, job postings, job transparency. Pay transparency when it comes to job postings. If you've got employees in Colorado, you better make sure that you're complying with that. That's stuff that will come out in your processes in an HR audit. Even just basic stuff like I-9. If you ever get audited by the Department of Labor, they take this stuff incredibly seriously. So you better have your I-9, which is, all your immigration paperwork showing eligibility to work.
And that created a bunch of new challenges, as all the HR professionals during COVID.
Remote.
It's like, how are we're supposed to be looking at this ID in person, but we don't hire anybody
showing my
in person
passport
now.
on Zoom, exactly.
So what's compliant now as far as doing the second part of the I-9 checks and those types of things? So
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think we have a few more minutes so we can wrap up in the last section. Yeah.
And I would just say, in terms of maybe landing in a final area, talking about maybe some other considerations that come into play. So who should conduct the audit? Certainly a company can do it internally, but I think that there are some significant merits to consider in terms of having it run with a third party. There are a handful of third parties out there that are very adept at doing this and are very familiar with the space. I believe that your company, actually, come to think of it, does these HR audits.
We do.
As well.
We provide some HR consulting services, and a lot is around the situation that I mentioned, because we're dealing from clients from startup to 1,500 employees, but we have a lot of companies that are in that transition that have somebody who is maybe carrying that torch of HR, but maybe doesn't have the experience quite yet. Or we have clients that have really seasoned HR professionals, but they want our team to kind of help with the compliance blocking and tackling, because they want to focus on the strategic part.
Sure.
So, looking at this, the depth of the team and where it's the best part for that internal team to use their resources and their time, that sometimes outsourcing some of this and having another set of eyes to keep an eye on these changes can be really beneficial.
I think that's critical. Look, we know that there's always cost realities here, and so whether you completely outsource it, I think completely outsourcing it is not the right approach, and I think doing it internally. I personally think that if you're trying to discover gaps, and I just don't think the internal team is going to be able to fully do that. I think they're going to have some blind spots because this is how we've always done it, and what an outside consultant can do is they can bring in a fresh set of eyes and say, here is what we're seeing out in the industry. Here's best practices. Had you ever considered this? I think if you do it fully internally, listen, it's better than nothing. And so if cost is a huge factor, then it certainly is better than nothing to do it internally. I think if you don't do it in conjunction and collaboration with some outside consultant like your organization, I think that's a big mistake, and I don't think it's going to be a very effective HR audit.
And it can be done a lot of times. It's such a fraction of adding headcount.
Yes.
For something that is, can be more structured.
And if the company hasn't done it in a while, or if there are some internal anticipated problems, there may want to be a consideration of also having it done in coordination with outside legal counsel, because if the project is done in coordination with outside legal counsel, that report can be protected by attorney-client privilege. So that's something to also think about as well in terms of being proactive and maybe being able to shield some of it from potential future disclosure.
And I think maybe the red question there.
Okay, yeah, great. We have one question that's come in that we'll share in the couple of minutes we have remaining. How should we be measuring our HR process to determine if they need to be changed?
Let's see. How should we be measuring the HR process to determine? Yeah, that's a great question. We talked about that, and that actually gets to my point that if you strictly do this without outside help, I think you're not going to have the awareness to know what needs to be changed, and so you really do have to have that outside consultancy to do. One thing as sort of an extension of that question is, what does the end of an HR audit look like? How do you know when you're done? Is there a report that's done? Is there, I've seen these done various different ways, and so the question is, do you have a report? who do you disseminate that to? And I think it's going to depend in a lot of ways. First off, what you find. To Seth's point, if you start to uncover a whole lot of misclassification, knowing that that is such a hot button issue right now, you don't want to be disseminating that throughout the entire staff, whether it's the HR staff or whatever. So you really do need to present these at the highest level and say, here's what we found. And make sure it has the good and the bad, because if it just has the bad, people are not going to even want to do this the next year and the year after. It's got to be a little bit celebratory and a little bit dose of reality.
Yeah, it has to be both. It has to be,
Yep.
commending for the positives, but also disclosing the negatives. Also, if the company is on the other side of a large up-ramp, where they brought a lot of new people on board, and there's been a significant growth and transition of the company, that would also be a good metric to consider putting that in some plans in the near future.
Yeah, and I think there should be at least something in writing. I'm not the biggest fan as a lawyer. I'm not the biggest fan of things, being totally laid out in writing, because I know that those become subject to discovery sometimes. But I do think there has to be a writing for this reason. These HR audits, if you do them consistently, are intended to build upon each one. And so it should not just be like, oh, we did one in January 2023, and then let's forget that one, and we did one in January 2024. They should build on each other. And listen, it's a reality that you have turnover, and so you want to make sure that there's memorialization of where you were in 23, and it also shows progress. It shows how you have improved over the years and closed down some of those gaps.
Yeah, and I would add, in kind of closing here, I think that in many ways, I look at these processes as like infrastructure, just like going out and getting an ERP system for your finance and your time, or getting that payroll and that human capital management system, or that billing system. These processes are also infrastructure that you need to have in place, because all of our GovCon clients, what they want to do, they want to grow. They want to grow. They grow more rapidly than usual commercial clients. And when they're maybe winning a contract and onboarding 10, 20, 200 employees at a time, that infrastructure needs to be in place.
Yep.
Because then you're trying to, as they say, kind of change the tires on the race car in the middle of turn 3.
Yeah.
Right,
And that gets
right.
really, really tough. So having that stuff in place before that happens, leads to overall success and supports the growth that they're all looking for. So
Good deal.
so
Time
great, gentlemen.
flies. Yep.
This went through
Time did
fast.
fly. Time did fly. We are up against our deadline here at 1:30. Thank you again for everyone that has joined us today. Again, we hope you're having a safe, enjoyable, and wonderful summer.
They're probably watching this on the beach, I'm guessing.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope
Golf
so. I
course.
hope so.
We might do our next one from the beach, do you think? Or
Could Todd give us like a cool background?
Todd can make that.
Yeah, we'll be in beach chairs. We'll still have our blazers.
That's right, that's
so it'll be
right.
good. But we do hope we will be back again in August. Hope you'll join us then. It will be August 15th. We're excited. A new topic we just added to our agenda based on some feedback. The topic could be navigating how the FLSA applies to federal contract employees. So look forward to diving into that with everyone. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.